Welcome back. I have some other things to do, but I decided to work on chess puzzles instead. So I'm trying to remind myself to first look for checks, captures, and threats. I've missed too many of these in some recent puzzles, and so that's what I'm going to do. I think that's my only check in this situation, and it doesn't look great. I mean, the king's going to recapture, right? And even though I have a follow-up check here, the king's just going to go back. So I don't think that's it. Captures. I have a capture here, but that piece is protected multiple ways. 4 ways. Whereas I only have 2 more pieces coming toward it. So I don't think that capture is it. That's just not forcing enough, right? Because any one of those pieces could go. My opponent, looks like we're even on material. We both have 6 pawns. We both have 2 minor pieces, 2 rooks, and a queen. So we're even on material. So, yeah, my opponent could easily decide to force a queen trade here, or probably not move that pawn because of where the king is. Although, if they took back with the bishop, I could move this pawn forward and have a discovered check. So that's a possibility. If they took with the... Yeah, see, but that's the thing. They don't have to take with the bishop. They could take with the rook, which puts my queen in immediate danger. And then I can't move the pawn forward for the discovered check with this bishop. They could take with the queen, as I've already said. If I took, and they took, and I could take back, and then they would have choices like this, and I could take back, and then they could take back with the pawn, which would block their bishop in, but it would keep this pawn blockaded, so this bishop over here becomes useless. So I'm going to pause this and give it a bigger think. One thing that I did not consider. I considered checks and captures, but I did not consider threats. And one threat that I just saw while giving this further looking was the f-pawn to f5. It's backed by the rook, and of course would also be protected by the queen, and it forks the queen and knight on g4 and e4. I don't know where. I assume at that point the queen would move, but I don't know to where it would move. But one thing that would change about this position is even if the queen just moved sideways to h4, so it's still guarding, still helping to protect the knight, that would give me an extra attacking piece on the knight. Because as we've said, I have 1, 2, 3 pieces hitting the knight, whereas they have 4 pieces hitting the knight. But if I move this pawn here, that forces a queen move, which I don't know where it would move. It wouldn't move here because then I would get a free queen, right? So f5. Their queen would not go here because I would get a free queen. I don't think it would go there because, as I've said, we're even on material. And if it did try to take my queen, I have backup. So then we could go ahead with, something here. And if they took my queen, I would take back, and their bishop would still be in danger. So I'm thinking this threat right here, f5, might be better. Because the checks don't look good, and the capture doesn't look good. As I said, this puts an extra piece on the knight. If the queen just moved sideways to h4, they still have 4 pieces guarding the knight, but so do I. And I would be starting that capture sequence with a pawn, which would open the file for my f rook. It would open or semi-open the F rook file. And if this pawn captures back, it's a fully open file for my rook that's on the F file right now. So I'm going to do that and hope for the best. Oh, that was it. Okay. And it moved where I thought it might. So now my question is, do I take it or wait for them to take me? Because again, if they take me, I have backup coming. So should I clear the file first? Or double their pawns? No. If I take first, they can also come back with their knight to take it, not doubling their pawns. This is like a whole new puzzle now. I kind of want to take first with the pawn. F captures E4. My thinking is that if I capture the queen first, the knight gets away. And then this pawn isn't threatening anything. In fact, it's under threat, right? Because my queen goes over there, the knight goes over there. Now, this bishop and the knight are both hitting that pawn that I only have one protector on. So I'm thinking I take the knight first. If they take my queen at that point, I take back, and I'm a piece up. And my rook is still guarding the E file. I've got to make a decision. That's because going here first doesn't make as much sense. It doesn't open the F file for my rook. It doesn't do anything extra to protect my queen. I'm thinking take the knight with the pawn. Or, oh wait, I just saw this. What about moving the pawn forward once more? Because then the queen has to move again. That's an interesting conundrum. It could just go here and be temporarily safe. And then my pawns are locked up here. It could come down here and threaten the queen trade again, because the knight guards that spot. I don't think that ends up helping me as much as just taking the knight. Fingers crossed. Okay, that was it. Now I think this is pretty obvious. Oh, okay, that was it. Okay. Wow. All right. Well, that took only 8 minutes compared to, I think, 12 on my last video. So let's go to the next one. And again, I'm going to look at it for a little bit, and then I will just pause so that I don't make the video longer than it has to be. And we are going to look for checks, captures, and threats. Here, I do not have any checks. None of my pieces. I have a light squared bishop, so it cannot check the king. And my rook currently cannot get to anywhere to check the king. So, captures. I can capture nothing. I can threaten the rook, but I assume it would just move up. I can capture the pawn. That's the only capture available to me. But that just, pretty sure that just loses a rook. And threats, as I said, this threat, I'm pretty sure the rook would just move up to re-threaten my piece. I do have a piece under threat, which is this pawn. Well, it's not, I guess we don't call those pieces, do we? I'm still in the habit of calling all 32 of them pieces. So, it makes a little sense to me to move the pawn up. But that's an empty threat. It protects the pawn, right? That's the only thing I'm thinking. It protects the pawn to move that up. But then I think the knight would just move here to threaten my bishop. What other threats do I have? Oh, I have this threat. You probably already saw that. But diagonals, for some reason, diagonals are, I think, my kryptonite, my weak point. The moving the bishop to a4 threatens the knight, which could just get out and hit the pawn, but then I get the rook. So what happens if I move my bishop to a4? That's my juiciest morsel so far. I think the rook would have to protect the knight, in which case I would win this pawn and put another piece against the knight. Or move the pawn up. Well, no, because if I move my bishop here and this rook moves over, then moving the pawn up doesn't help, because at that point this knight could just move someplace, like behind the pawn, where it would be threatening my bishop. But I think that might be the best move to start with, and that would get the rook off of this pawn, and I could take it. But I would have to take the pawn before taking the knight, because if I did this, they moved over and I took the knight, then the rook is guarding the pawn again. So I'm going to try that. I didn't even have to pause. Okay, that was it. The rook did go where I thought it would. And I think I have to give up this pawn now and take this one. But before I do, what happens if I move this pawn forward to threaten the knight? Where does it go? I think I already said it's going to go behind the pawn and threaten my bishop. Pretty sure. But if it did that, I could still take this pawn, but then it would take my bishop. So I think I have to take the pawn first, but then it would take this pawn, and then I would have to move this bishop somewhere. Well, if it did take that pawn, I wouldn't absolutely have to move the bishop somewhere. I could check first and then move the bishop somewhere. Maybe. I'm going to take the pawn. What was it? Dang it. Well, I only lost 8 points. Is that because I got the first move right? I guess it's because I got the first move right. Okay. It was the rook. Oh, it was to pin the rook to the knight. And then the knight takes the pawn and gives me the rook? I think I missed something there. Okay, well here I easily figured out. There's only one good move, and I figured that out. And they have 2 good moves. It says they can protect the knight here or move the rook over. They're about the same. Actually, it's now, if I'm letting the engine run, it's saying a6 is better. But they didn't do a6. They did rook to b8. But now I only have one good move. And it's not that. What's the problem with that again? What happens? The knight takes here, as I thought it would. And it says I can come to here, but I could also say check. I could also check first, right? Then what happens? The king goes here, and then I move the bishop to here. Now what's the problem? Oh, the problem is this. And the bishop has to keep guarding this diagonal because of the king. Okay, I think I understand that. But now it can go here. And the only thing I can do to keep protecting the king is to go back to f1. And then my bishop is basically useless until I can get one of these pawns out of the way. Okay, so go back to, I have to go rook b1. It's the only good move. And in the puzzle, the knight took this pawn, but the engine is saying, again, their best move is a6. But in the puzzle it did that, and I only have one good move, which is, I mean, I figured that one out. And then in a game, of course, they would take here. Then what would I do? Get behind this pawn? I think so. It says I wouldn't do that. It says I would go to e8. Oh, because this pawn's more advanced. Okay. All right. Well, 3 points lower than when I started the video. All right. Okay. End games. This is one of the things that I need to be working on. Now, I have a passed pawn, but it's very vulnerable over there by itself. Now, I assume the reason that the king has moved here is because I had just penned it. And also it might be preparing this if I don't take. But my question is, I think if I just take, what's the problem with that? Any reasonable opponent would take back, and then they can't stop this pawn. I mean, I'm going to have to bring my king, I think. So let's follow that through. I mean, rook captures f7. It's not check, but I mean, then the king would just move and leave my rook standing? No. Rook captures f7, king captures f7. And then if I just start moving the pawn, the king gets there in time, I think. Yeah. Okay, I was pretty sure. So that's why I said once the king recaptures on f7, I would have to bring my king. So maybe the question is how to bring the king is what the problem is going to be, I believe. Is it going to... No, because if I go forward, it goes over, and then it's going to get to the corner first, and it's going to be a draw. So if I go diagonally, does it still get there in time? Well, then it can't come here, so it has to go there, and I beat it to the corner. I think if I just go straight down this light square diagonal, I beat it. Let's try. Okay, I was right. Now, here's the hard part. I think we've already calculated that if I go forward, they get the opposition, and then all I can do is go left, and they beat me there. And then what do I do? Yeah, so I think I have to go diagonally, because even if they go left to e7, I go to c6, they then cannot go to d7. The only way to get closer to the corner would be to go back to d8. And then I go to b7, and they can't get closer. Okay. Okay. I'm working on end games. I know it's a lot of counting. I know that there's a thing called the pawn square. I think it's like something like this, that if the king can get inside that square before you start advancing the pawn, and the king was here, so it was already inside that square. Something like that. So if I had moved the pawn, then it would still be it would still be inside the square, and if I moved the pawn, it would still be inside that square. Okay. Next one. That rook has... Oh, it's got a nice little battery lined up here. And when it moves, I'm going to be in check. So that's a problem. Big problem. However, I just need to be aware of my situation here. And my situation is I'm about to be in a discover check. And I have no piece that can capture that rook right now. So I'm going to look at checks, captures, and threats. The only checks I have are 2, I think. I have this check, which, because that light square, because g8 is guarded by my bishop, I think the king would have to recapture. And if it did, I would have a follow-up check here. Queen captures g6, guarded by the pawn. the king would have to go back to h8. And then that would be mate, I think, because those are all checks, right? Check. It can't move out. Would have to recapture. Queen captures g6, check. The king has to retreat. And then queen to h6 is mate. Okay, I'm pretty sure that's it. But the only other check that I have is this one, which I think is really bad because I just lose a rook. And I'm still dealing with this down here, and I do not have any further checks. But because I'm pretty sure I calculated that this is mate, I'm going to go for it. Okay. Because, again, the bishop guards that square, and nothing can get in the way. 2020. Okay, that's more progress than I made in my last video. 7 points net. I'm going to stop. Thank you for watching.